In this video, we will discuss consumers' perceptions of packaging and their role in the transition to circular packaging. First, it is important to understand that packaging is often named the silent salesman for very good reasons. Packaging attributes are strongly influencing the perceptions of consumers, whether these perceptions are about the packaging itself or about the product. Regarding the perceptions of the packaging, colors and graphics, materials and claims are important for consumers to determine whether a packaging is environment friendly. However, what you see is that their perceptions are often different from what is actually sustainable, especially when you take the carbon footprint as an indicator to assess the sustainability of the packaging. For example, consumers often perceive glass as one of the most sustainable materials, whereas when not reused and simply recycled, it is one of the worst performing materials. I must also mention the issue of greenwashing. Greenwashing is becoming a prevalent problem in today's world. There has been a lack of industrial regulation, which has been used by many companies to exploit consumers' growing interest in caring for nature, without really making the efforts to make the packaging as sustainable as possible. As a result, many consumers feel lost when confronted with sustainability claims on packaging, which can lead to skepticism. Honesty and transparency should definitely be at the forefront of marketing strategies. Consumers also use packaging to draw inferences about the product. Various studies have shown that packaging strongly influences how people perceive the product that it contains. For example, some years ago I demonstrated, using several randomized controlled trials, that packaging with a recycled brown look were likely to have a positive influence on the perceived quality of the product because of the naturalness evoked by the packaging. Similarly, more recently, we demonstrated that products sold in returnable packaging are also perceived to have a higher quality compared to products sold in single-use disposable packaging. It is important to note that innovating in the field of packaging can also lead to some challenges in terms of consumer acceptance and behavior. In that respect, the link between packaging and categorization is important to mention. When the visual appearance of the package drastically changes, it can create challenges for brands because what we know from research about packaging appearance is that it helps consumers to categorize products. So if the visual appearance of the package becomes too atypical as a result of sustainable innovation, then people tend to have more negative evaluations about the product, and it is explained by the fact that people do not categorize it correctly. Think of shampoo bars, for example. That could be put in a category of soap by some consumers and not be deemed as good for your hair as more conventional shampoo. So it is important to put efforts into making sure that the product is still perceived as being part of the same category as it was before and also remains in the same field as the competitors, let's say. Another challenge is related to rebound effects. Rebound effects in the context of sustainable packaging refer to a situation where the adoption of more environmentally friendly packaging materials or practices inadvertently leads to increased resource consumption or negative environmental consequences elsewhere in the system. A good example is the lightweighting, that is the reduction of the weight of plastic bottles, which can make them less valuable in recycling programs and which can result in more bottles ending up in landfills or incineration facilities. Another example, more applied to consumer behavior, is related to reusable cotton bags, the famous tote bags. To reach their break-even point, which is the minimum number of uses necessary for the reusable bag to be preferable than a single-use bag, they need to be reused more than 100 times. However, because people consider them sustainable, they tend to collect them and not use them intensely enough so that in the end, their carbon footprint is worse than that of plastic bags. Finally, I would like to end with the fact that consumers' participation is especially important for the transition to circular packaging. Often, we see that consumers are very enthusiastic about the introduction of sustainable packaging innovations, and provided that the price would not increase drastically, they generally state that they would prefer that innovation. In a recent study, we studied what drives and hinders the adoption of reusable packaging systems. We invited consumers to our lab and we asked them to engage with a refillable packaging system, to take the reusable packages home, and we interviewed them again 2 weeks later. Well, we found that participants were at first very positive and enthusiastic about using the reusable packaging systems they were presented with, and that they would be very much willing to use it when doing their grocery shopping. However, we also found that many factors were likely to have a negative effect on their adoption. We saw that the long-term adoption of reusable packaging could be hindered by, for example, a lack of product variety, the inadequate accessibility of the dispensers, the lack of compatibility between systems, or the extra time or efforts consumers have to put to consume products in reusable packaging. All these factors can all have a negative effect on the participation of consumers in the transition to circular and reusable packaging. At the end of the day, for an innovation to be successful, it has to be durably adopted by consumers. It is therefore important to test concepts in detail to try and avoid pitfalls as much as possible and ensure consumer participation in the long term.